Well, hello, IS 501 students. That's how Dr. Bangs always starts his videos. I am Lee Sane, and I am from Group D, and I am going to talk a little bit about what our group discussed as far as the use of the round wafer. I have it right here. Hold on, let's see if I can get it out of the little packet. The round disc wafer as for the bread of communion. So our group had quite a lengthy discussion about this element, and I'm going to share that information with you now. So I'm just going to kind of go through the questions and talk about the ways that we sort of synthesized this information as we discussed it together. So the first question is, how would it typically be distributed in the churches who use this version? So we talked about the fact that usually this type of wafer is used in the Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, maybe the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's usually used in quite a formal type setting. I am a member of a Presbyterian church. I'm on staff here at a Presbyterian church, and we've used these occasionally, but most of the time you see these used in more formal services. And we talked about the fact that it is usually distributed as the people come forward. Oftentimes you'll even see the priest or the pastor place it on the tongue of the parishioners as they come forward to the altar. We've used these before too on plates that are passed around. Of course, now with COVID, we don't do that anymore at all. We use these little, I call them Lunchables, communion Lunchables. I don't think that's very holy, but that's what we call them around here, so that each person has their own kind of individual. But prior to that, I think that the coming forward we all talked about would have been extremely important part of the service as the people come forward to partake of the elements. And I think that we did focus on the fact that it holds a lot of meaning as you come forward to the altar to take those elements from the priest or the pastor. Let's see. The next question is, would people come forward? We talked about that, about the 4 moments of the liturgical drama. So we had a lot of discussion about these 4 moments of the liturgical drama and how those are kind of symbolized in the use of this round disc wafer. So we talked about the oblation, and we all pretty much agreed that when they use these wafers, usually there's also a loaf of bread that is set up at the front for the use of the beginning of the words of institution, as the pastor or the priest or whoever's celebrating communion would use that loaf of bread to symbolize what Christ did at the Last Supper. So we all agreed that it would be a symbol of Christ's body that was given for us, and a symbol of remembrance, and the bringing of the gifts to the altar, the labors of our hands as the bread was made and formed and brought to the altar. And then we talked about the Eucharist, which is the prayer of thanksgiving, the great prayer of thanksgiving, which is usually done after that. And then the fraction, which happens as the bread is broken, when the words of institution are repeated for the congregation, and the priest or the pastor says, "This is my body broken for you, take and eat." And that is done in front of the congregation, not usually with these wafers. It's usually done with a loaf of bread, and then the wafers are the symbols that are distributed after that. And then we talked about the communion, and we saw that this wafer, the circle of this wafer, like the symbol of the unity of Christ's body as it is given to the parishioners and to the congregation to partake, that it is quite a powerful symbol in that. And what would the service typically look like? So we talked about how usually these are used in formal type services. The liturgy is quite important in the taking of communion, and in the services where these round wafers are used. It is usually a very formal setting where people are kneeling or coming forward to the altar to take them. We also talked about the circle being the oneness of Christ's body as it is given for us, and us as a congregation being one in Christ as we partake of communion. And that kind of goes into the next question, which is, what does this version of the bread suggest about God, Christ, and the nature of the church? Again, we all, in all of our answers, talked about the symbolic circle of the wholeness and the fullness of Christ. And also, most of them, this one doesn't, but most of the ones you see will have a cross in the symbol, and the idea that Christ is the center of everything that we do within the church, and that's symbolized by that cross being in the center of that wafer. And it's also a cue for remembering the way that Christ's body was broken. These are unleavened, so when you break them, they make that sound. I think Dr. Banks talked about that in his video as well, but the breaking of Christ's body, which had to happen. We're reminded of that as we partake of the unleavened and the thin and the breaking of the wafer. And we also talked about in the nature of the church, the idea that we are united through God's love, that circle is made complete in that we are all brought together under what God did for us on the cross. And one of the things that we kept pointing to, the importance of communion in the life of the fellowshipping community, was that everything leads to the table, that everything we do, everything that all of our worship, it leads to the sacrifice that Christ made, and the way that we celebrate that at the table, and the need to remember that we need to feed on the body of Jesus. That's what he calls us to do, to take and to eat, and that we are reminded of that as we take these wafers in communion. And I think I'm looking to see. I think I've answered. We talked a lot about the different ways that communion can be taken, and how the circle really is what's so I think meaningful about these wafers and what they symbolize as they're used in the more formal traditions of worship. And I think we all, as we kind of talked about the ways our different churches are handling COVID and communion, it has been one of the most difficult things to figure out how to implement that practice, and taking these lunchable things at our seats by ourselves. It definitely takes away some of the holiness and the idea that we come forward and we come before the Lord as one body together when we celebrate communion. So that's what Group D talked about, and I look forward to hearing everyone else's videos and